Now I want to apologize in advance for how complicated it gets right here, because this really has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with the history of the software. Our software has been around for 25 years, and because of the earlier dependence on the Pi API, and actually the continuing dependence on the Pi API, that's one layer of software for some of our applications, those API-based connecting clients actually have a different set of connection credentials than the more recent clients that are based on the Pi SDK. That's the software development kit that's more recent than the API, the application programming interface. So to make a long story short, if you've got an API-based application, like for example an interface, most interfaces are API-based in one degree or another, or a copy of process book or data link from before version 3, anything 2.x or 1.x, those are using an API-based connection. The connection credentials we get from those applications consist of three things: the name of the application, the IP address and the net mask, and basically the IP address we get, and then the network path, which is basically the host name, either the local name or the fully qualified name, joepc.osisoft.com. Now the application name is a little more subtle than you might guess, because the application name is restricted to just the first 4 characters of the name of the application plus the letter E. Now we've already seen an example of this. If we take a look back at this first example here, here's MyTrust1. Look at the application name here. Application name is API B and then E. That's actually the API buffering application along with the letter E. Why the letter E? Well, it has to do with the history of the software. Long before we settled on using Ethernet, there were other networks out there, and we actually supported others, but of course Ethernet won that war, and so now we distinguish, or we are, the legacy of that is that the last character in all the application names for the API connections are always going to be an E. So it's the first 4 characters of the application name. That application name can be determined by looking at the log file. If you look at your message log, look at how we're attempting to connect. You'll see the name of that application in your message log. So it's the first 4 characters of that name plus the letter E. Now, with a more modern client like the Pi SDK clients of system management tools, the current version of Process Book Data Link 3.x, etc., those newer applications have those same connection criteria plus 2 more. So they have the application name, the IP address, and the network path, but we can also derive from them the local domain name. That would be basically the the Windows domain. And we can also get the operating system username, so that would be the Windows username. Okay. This is, by the way, how we can make use of the single sign-on capability. Is if we can get the Windows name, we can pass that through and let you connect as a user who has that same name. Now, the application name is simply going to be the name of the executable. It doesn't follow the same convention, the 4 characters plus E. So for those, it would simply be, for example, procbook.exe. That's the name of the process book application. Now, one final mention: if you look at the bottom of your page on this slide, you will see notes that show you exactly what connection credentials there are for different operating systems and different API versus SDK-based applications. Before we go any further, let's actually see the effect of the trust in action. I'm running a copy of Excel, and I can use the add-in called Pi Data Link to choose the connections dialog, and I can try to connect using the user called PiAdmin. As you can see, I'm going to connect using this default user. When I choose to connect, if you recall earlier in the class, we set a password for student, or for PiAdmin, so I actually have to type in the password in order to get in. And now I am connected. If I refresh this, I'm connected as PiAdmin. Now watch what happens if we add a trust. And actually, let's look at before and after in our message logs. I'm going to look back let's go with the last 2 minutes. And we should see that there's been a successful login. There we go. There is the successful login. And I don't see anything in, yeah, here it is. Here's a trust request. We tried to connect. We always try to connect first using trust. And in this case, we did not pass that test, so we were prompted with a user and password, and then finally we logged in and it was a successful login. Now watch what happens if we go into the trust database. I create a brand new trust. This is on my server now. I'm just going to call this my trust 5. And my trust 5 is simply going to be known by the network path is going to be the name of my computer, NICGX280, and the Pi user, let's set this to, well, let me see, was it Len? Yeah, Len was one of our users, and if you remember, Len has a password. His password is Len. Now watch what happens when I save this, and now I try to connect again. I'll choose Pi, Connections. I'll attempt to connect, and as you can see, I connected immediately, and if we refresh this, we can see we're connecting as Len. Well, how did we connect as Len? If you go out to our message logs, again, let's go back the last 2 minutes, what you can find is, yes, here it is. We are making an initialization, or we're initializing the connection using let me see. We're initializing this connection first as a trust. We're trying to see if there is a trust that exists. And as you can see right here, this trust does exist. It is a trust called MyTrust5, and we're saying that when we connect that way, the user is going to be Len. Now, even though, if you recall, Len had a password requirement, this bypasses that entirely. We do not need Len to type in his password, because what we've simply said is the fact that you're in the trust database, that you've been trusted because your computer is NICGX280, then we're going to give you the same privileges as Len. And that's in fact who I'm connected as. I'm connected as Len, and even though he required a password, the trust table will allow him to connect without that password prompt. And of course, that's exactly what you want to happen at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, so that you don't get that phone call if your interface restarts.